with the triumphal entry. It begins at the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, where they were to, so it begins right before the anointing at Bethany, and then it goes into the Last Supper, and the betrayal, then the Last Supper, and so forth. And then what we're going to begin today is that the and John's passion begins not at the Last Supper, but he begins at the garden in the Kidron Valley. And we're going to begin with the Passion of Mark tonight with this story about the Garden of Gethsemane. And so, and I mean, if you really look at it, there's two stories of the garden, the suffering in the garden, the passion in the garden are, I mean, there's a story in Mark, and the only story in John about it is that they were there. He doesn't tell us anything about Jesus praying or anything else at the garden. And again, I think it relates to that, what we talked about at the beginning of this, that Mark has a much lower Christology than Jesus, than John has, where Mark is portraying Jesus very much as a human being. John is portraying him much more as a divine human being. You know, he was God first and human second. And for Mark, it was almost like all through Mark's gospel, it's almost like Jesus comes to realize who he is in his ministry. He doesn't, whereas in John's gospel, from the very beginning, we're told that Jesus knew who he was and that there was no question about it, and that everything he did was based on his knowledge of who he was, and all of the signs that and miracles that he did were meant to point to who he is and who he was. And so just if do you have the reading about for Mark's arrest and trial, the first one? I mean the I think it's the arrest. Okay, the agony in the garden. From Mark 14:32 to 52. It's then they came to a place named Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." He took with him Peter, James, and John, and began to be troubled and distressed. Then he said to them, "My soul is sorrowful even unto death. Remain here and keep watch." He advanced a little and fell to the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass by him. He said, "Abba, Father, all things are possible to you. Take this cup away from me, but not what I will, but what you will." When he returned, he found them asleep. He said to Peter, "Simon, are you asleep? Could you not keep watch for 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not undergo the test. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." Withdrawing again, he prayed, saying the same thing. Then he returned once more and found them asleep, for they could not keep their eyes open and did not know what to answer him. He returned a third time and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? It is enough. The hour has come. Behold, the Son of Man is to be handed over to sinners. Get up, let us go. See, my betrayer is at hand." So, as we see in that agony in the garden, Jesus is he's tortured by what he has to go through, even to the point where he even asks that the Father take this cup from him. Now, that's not a very divine attribute, you wouldn't say. That's That's a very human attribute, to be faced with death and want and not have to do it, not have to go through it. That certainly is a very human attribute. And as I said, Mark, John, there's no agony in the garden. There's no prayer in the garden. It's just they go to the garden because that's where they always went, and when they were in Jerusalem, and so it was a place that Judas knew, and so they went there, and Judas came with the guards to arrest him, and it's also, again, we have Jesus there. He is praying, and he's by himself, even though he brings all the disciples with him, except for Judas, of course. And then he takes Peter, James, and John, his three close henchmen, and he brings them even further into the garden to be with him and to be by his side in this trying time. And they what do? They fall asleep. They abandon him, so to speak. So Mark's, again, he's showing us this the aloneness of Jesus in this whole struggle, that he was very much on his own, even though the 12 were around him and near him. Even at this point, they still weren't there for him. They weren't present for him, and they had no idea what was going on. That messianic secret that Mark talks about or uses throughout his gospel is here itself. It's showing itself again here, even in this hour right before his passion and death, and so it's Mark's telling us how the disciples have let him down again. So it, like I said, it just shows us that he's not. Mark doesn't paint a great picture of who the disciples are in his gospel, and but he does it for a purpose too. So then we'll move on to the betrayal and the arrest of Jesus. And now I'm going to read both accounts, Mark and then John. Then, while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived, accompanied by a crowd with swords and clubs, who had come from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. His betrayer had arranged a signal with them, saying, "The man I shall kiss is the one. Arrest him and lead him away secretly or securely." He came and immediately went over to him and said, "Rabbi," and he kissed him. At this, they laid hands on Jesus and arrested him. One of the bystanders drew his sword, struck the high priest's servant, and cut off his ear. Jesus said to them in reply, "Have you come out as against a robber, with swords and clubs to seize me? Day after day I was with you, teaching in the temple area, yet you did not arrest me. But that the scriptures may be fulfilled, and that the scriptures may be fulfilled." And they all left him and fled. Now a young man followed him, wearing nothing but a linen cloth about his body. They seized him, but he left the cloth behind and ran off naked. And now the story of the arrest and betrayal in the Gospel of John. Okay, 18, 1-11. When he had said this, Jesus went out with his disciples across the Kidron Valley to where there was a garden into which he and his disciples entered. Judas, his betrayer, also knew the place, because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas got a band of soldiers and guards from the chief priests and the Pharisees and went there with lanterns, torches, and weapons. Jesus, knowing everything that was going to happen to him, went out and said to him, whom are you looking for? They answered him, Jesus the Nazarene. He said to them, I am. Judas, his betrayer, who was also with them. When he said to them, I am, they turned away and fell to the ground. So he again said to them, whom are you looking for? Then they said, Jesus the Nazarene. Jesus answered, I told you that I am. So if you are looking for me, let these men go. This was to fulfill what he had said. I have not lost any of those you gave me. Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it, struck the high priest's slave, and cut off his right ear. The slave's name was Malchus. Jesus said to Peter, put your sword into its scabbard. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father gave me? So these are the two stories of the arrest of Jesus from John and from Mark. Just offhand, what do you notice are that the things that are different about these two stories?
Jeez, this
Well,
is crazy. Hi.
There's no
What?
mention
Hello.
of, there's no mention of the kiss in the
Right, there's
second.
no mention of the kiss in the Gospel of John.
Really, all the disciples aren't really mentioned. They're kind of in the background. So it's almost, I know it did say that the group went, but they were just kind of not essential to the story.
Yeah, they were innocent bystanders, you might say, in John's story. And in Mark's story, he's trying to show how pitiful they were in a sense.
Also,
John's,
Mark's version says that it was a bystander who cut off the ear
Yeah,
of,
that's what I was trying to find.
but in John's, it names Peter as being the man with the sword.
Right. So Peter's named directly as the person with the sword in John, and none of the synoptic traditions say it was Peter.
John's gospel, he is interrogated by the soldiers and says that I am, which is a reference to him being God.
Right. And the soldiers are the ones that end up on the ground, right? Whereas in Gethsemane in Mark's gospel, we see Jesus is the one prostrate on the ground. Where in John's gospel, the ones who came to arrest Jesus are the ones prostrate on the ground. And so there's a huge contrast right there, that again, that high and low Christology showing themselves off glaringly by those two images there, those two contrasting images. Couple of other things to note, that there was a bystander or a follower of Jesus in the story of the Gospel of Mark. There's a follower of Jesus who doesn't abandon him, who tries to follow him. So I think they're trying to say it's one of his disciples. And so one of his disciples doesn't try to abandon Jesus. And yet when someone puts their hands on him, he flees off naked, we're told. He runs away. And the stuff I was reading says that it's a contrasting image also, where at the beginning of the Gospel of Mark, what do we have? We have James and John and Peter and Andrew being called by Jesus. And what do? They leave everything and they follow Jesus. And then at the end of the Gospel of Mark, here we have this disciple of Jesus trying to follow Jesus, and when in a sense, being put on the spot to, are you going to follow him or not? He leaves everything. He abandons Jesus by leaving everything. So it's, the disciples are, again, they're shown in a terrible light in the Passion of Mark. And Jesus, again, is this lone person in the gospel, in the Passion, where he's the one that's going through it all by himself, all alone. And it's again, it's that connection to the suffering servant of Isaiah, which I'm gonna read you a part of in a little bit. But so it's, you have these images, these very different images where Jesus says, "I am," by only speaking one word. The men who came to arrest him are on the ground prostrate before him. He says, and that's in John, and he's the one that has to almost initiate and say, "Come on, you came to arrest me, do it." You know, he's almost pleading with them to arrest him. Whereas in the Gospel of Mark, he's pleading with the Father to take this cup away from him. So again, those contrasting images of Jesus, it's and again, it pays to remember that this is it is theology, so it isn't meant to be a history about everything that actually took place, but it is a theology written for a particular Christian community at a particular time and place in history, and it's meant to help teach them and help them to deal with their own issues of faith in their own space and time. So Mark's community, remember, is a community going through persecution, much persecution at the hands of Nero's Roman Empire, and so they're suffering martyrdom. Literally, people are dying because of their Christian faith, and then John's Christian community is suffering from being thrown out of synagogues where they had been traditionally worshiping and going for prayer and liturgy at these synagogues, and so they've been tossed out of these synagogues. They've been alienated by their communities, and they're kind of reforming a new community out of that, to support one another and to develop a new place to believe and to worship and to celebrate their faith in Jesus. So it's a little, so their persecution is more at the hands of the local Jewish authorities, whereas the Markan community's persecution is more at the hands of Roman authorities. So you have, and that will show itself too in these accounts as well. So here we are. So after the betrayal and arrest, we'll hear of the trial of Jesus, where they start the trial. They go on the trial of Jesus, talking about so Mark, he goes before the Sanhedrin or before the council, and in John he goes before Annas. So here it is. It's from Mark, before the Sanhedrin. They led Jesus away to the high priest, and all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes came together. Peter followed him at a distance into the high priest's courtyard and was seated with the guards, warming himself at the fire. The chief priests and the entire Sanhedrin kept trying to obtain testimony against Jesus in order to put him to death, but they found none. Many gave false witness against him, but their testimony did not agree. Some took the stand and testified falsely against him, alleging, "We heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another not made with hands.' Even so, their testimony did not agree. The high priest rose before the assembly and questioned Jesus, saying, Have you no answer? What are these men testifying against you?" But he was silent and answered nothing. Again, the high priest asked him and said to him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" Then Jesus answered, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power, coming with the clouds of heaven, and coming with the clouds of heaven." At that, the high priest tore his garments and said, "What further need have we of witnesses? Have you heard the blasphemy? What do you think?" They all condemned him as deserving to die. Some began to spit on him. They blindfolded him and struck him and said to him, "Prophesy." And the guards greeted him with blows. And then in John, we are from 18:12 to 14, and then the inquiry before Pius. So the band of soldiers, the tribune, and the Jewish guards bound him and brought him to Annas first. He was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. It was I don't know what, I can't see it because can someone read that? Oh,
Page 25 in the book.
Read it.
Okay, want me to read it?
yeah, why don't you read it?
So the band of soldiers, the tribune and the Jewish guards seized Jesus, bound him, and brought him to Annas first. He was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. It was Caiaphas who had counseled the Jews that it was better that one man should die rather than the people. Simon Peter and another disciple followed Jesus. Now the other disciple was known to the high priest, and he entered the courtyard of the high priest with Jesus. Peter stood at the gate outside. So the other disciple, the acquaintance of the high priest, went out and spoke to the gatekeeper and brought Peter in. Then the maid, who was the gatekeeper, said to Peter,
You can stop.
that's it.
Okay, then can you go on to where it says the high priest questioned Jesus about
Sure.
about his disciples?
Okay, so the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his doctrine. Jesus answered him, "I have spoken publicly to the world. I have also taught in a synagogue or in the temple area where all the Jews gather, and in secret I have said nothing. Why ask me? Ask those who heard me what I said to them. They know what I said." When he had said this, one of the temple guards standing there struck Jesus and said, "Is this the way you answer the high priest?" Jesus answered him, "If I have spoken wrongly, testify to the wrong. But if I have spoken rightly, why do you strike me?" Keep going. Yep.
And then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. So that's it. So again, we noticed a couple of different things here too. All right.
Side by side.
Again, listening to it, what were your takes on what was different about it? On those two, on Mark's account and John's account, what do you hear that was different?
I can't find the part because I can't see it, but the fact that Peter is mentioned in Mark's, just Peter.
Yeah,
I
well,
believe.
I meant, yeah, you're right. In the Gospel of John, Peter gets into the courtyard by the help of that mysterious beloved disciple. Well, although he's not even mentioned as the beloved
But
disciple there.
who's the one that's the friend of the high priest that they're referring to in John's version?
Well, again, that's assumed to be the beloved disciple that John talks about, but it's not stated explicitly who it was. So we don't know who it is. But Peter has to get help to get into the high priest's courtyard even. Whereas in Mark,
Right.
Peter doesn't get any help to get into the high priest's courtyard. The other thing is in Mark, he goes before the whole Sanhedrin. He doesn't go just before the father-in-law. It's like Annas, the father-in-law of the high priest, brings him to his home almost, or he stands in for Caiaphas in the Gospels of John, whereas Jesus never goes before Caiaphas and before the high priest in the Gospel of John. He never goes before the Sanhedrin. It's only this father-in-law of the high priest that questions him. So it's almost like an illicit trial. It's like he's being questioned by the police and not being read his rights. It's technicality, that would have shows some dirty dealing, you might say, on the part of the high priest and the Jews who are seeking his death. And so John, again, that picture of the Jews as kind of the bad guys in this, he does that quite frequently throughout his gospel. And here he does it again with the Jewish high authority, temple authority. He shows them doing a lot of backdoor stuff here. And whereas in Mark's gospel, it's the full Sanhedrin there. And he's questioned by the Sanhedrin, even though Mark's trial is no less dirty than John's trial is, no less corrupt, you'd say. It's still it's more along the lines of what a trial would have been actually like at the time of Jesus by the Sanhedrin, by the priests of Judaism. They would have had the whole Sanhedrin there. The high priest would have been there, and so they would have had questioning, and witnesses would have been brought, and so forth. These were kind of the modes of conducting a trial at that time. And so, but John doesn't waste any time getting into the details of it or why, how, showing us, that witnesses were brought or any of that. Mark doesn't tell us in his story, he doesn't tell us, like, he says that many gave false witness. And then he says, like, they said that he said that he would destroy this temple made with hands in 3 days, and in 3 days rebuild it with a temple not made with hands. He doesn't tell us how that's a false witness, because Jesus said that. Well, he said something similar to it at the when he cleansed the temple, as we're told after the entrance into Jerusalem. And so he doesn't bother going into some of the details of it, but he does go into the fact that it was a legitimate trial, you might say. He gives them credit for that much, even though it's a corrupt legitimate trial. And as he goes through it, again, Jesus is being questioned, and what does Jesus do? He doesn't do anything. He doesn't answer. The only answer he gives is the final one where they make the sentence of blasphemy on him. He says, where he's been asked if he is the son of the blessed one directly by the high priest. And the high priest, and he says to him, yes, I am. You will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven. So, in the face of his accusers, in the face of all this false testimony, he's silent. And then after he is tried and convicted, what happens? They begin to mock him. So they blindfold him and they strike him and they say, prophesy, prophesy. So what is Jesus to the Jews? He is a prophet. To the Jewish religious authorities, they consider him he was a prophet, but they're saying he's a false prophet. So and that's important to remember too, because Mark will contrast that then in the next passage. Now, if we can go on to the two stories of the what do you call it? Peter's denial. You have those. Okay, where
Yeah, I just, I misformatted
it's
this
in
one,
Mark
so-
66, Mark 14, 66 through 72
Okay. Mark should be
is
out
the
now.
Peter's denial of Jesus. So now remember this, where Mark tells us that while Jesus was being brought into the Sanhedrin and the high priest, at the same time he kind of interrupts that dialogue or that thought, and he says, while at the same time Peter is entering into the courtyard of the high priest. Okay, and now we go in. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she stared at him and said,
66.
you also were with Jesus, the man from Nazareth. But Peter denied it, saying, I do not know or understand what you are talking about. And he went out into the forecourt. Then the cock crowed. And the servant girl, on seeing him, began again to say to the bystanders, this man is one of them. But again, Peter denied it. Then, after a little while, the bystanders again said to Peter, certainly you are one of them, for you are a Galilean. But he began to curse, and he swore an oath, I do not know this man that you are talking about. At that moment, the cock crowed for the second time. Then Peter remembered that Jesus said to him, before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And he broke down and wept. And before we go on to John, I want to just go into this a little bit here. Now, so it's almost, Mark is presenting these almost as simultaneous occurrences. While Jesus is upstairs in the Sanhedrin being questioned and by the Sanhedrin, and he's silent to their questions. Peter's downstairs, outside in the courtyard, being questioned not by the Sanhedrin, but by their servants. And so we have a picture of Jesus upstairs, silent, quiet, being questioned, on trial, and Peter outside in the courtyard, in a sense, on trial. So here you have it again, that picture of Jesus, that picture of his disciples, and in particular Peter. And so Peter, what does he do? 3 times he's questioned, he denies him, even to the point where Mark implies that Peter almost curses Jesus in his swearing an oath that he does not know him. Almost curses Jesus, almost goes that far as to say, not only do I not know the man, curse him. Let him be damned.
Hmm.
And, to avoid being associated with Jesus. He goes that far, we're told. And so while Jesus is upstairs being tried, Peter's downstairs failing miserably at his trial. And what happens? Upstairs, Jesus is pronounced guilty. Downstairs, Peter is acquitted, in a sense, acquitted by the authorities questioning him. They don't push it any further. Jesus upstairs, he gets found guilty. He's convicted as a blasphemer. Downstairs, they leave Peter alone after that. Peter finds himself guilty. That's the difference. Peter realizes when he hears the cock crow the second time, he realizes, oh my God, what have I done? And he weeps out of shame. And so Mark juxtaposes these two trials with one another in his writing. This is where Mark is an artist in many ways. He's a very good how would you say it? What do you say? Author. He's a writer with much talent in many ways. He uses irony. He uses this comparative literature, but it's a subtle comparison. He doesn't say, look at Jesus, look at Peter, but he says, he puts them right next to each other. So you have to look at it almost. And so you can see me, right?
Yep.
Okay. So you have, so it's a beautiful portrayal or use of these comparative literature there, and then in the Gospel of John, we hear about Peter's denial of Jesus. Now John splits it up a little bit, where we're told where he's allowed into the high priest courtyard by his friendship with this disciple whom we don't know who he is, and Simon Peter and another disciple followed Jesus. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter was standing outside at the gate. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out, spoke to the woman who guarded the gate, and brought Peter in. The woman said to Peter, "You are not also one of this man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I am not." Now the slaves and the police had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing around it and warming themselves. Peter also was standing with them and warming himself. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. They asked him, so that breaks off and they go back to the trial with Jesus. But then it comes back to it after the quick trial with Annas and Caiaphas. And now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. They asked him, "You are not also one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it and said, "I am not." One of the slaves of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Again, Peter denied it. And at that moment, the cock crowed. Now, here, again, it's where Mark is very much concerned about a community that's under persecution by the Roman authorities. John is not as concerned about that. So his depiction of Peter is different. he doesn't show us, he doesn't tell us that Peter wept. He doesn't give us that image of Peter. He just tells us that Peter denied him. And not only that, it's made a little bit worse in the sense that there was a witness there to see this disciple, this unknown disciple that got them in there, is witnessing all this. And so Peter's faith is not strong enough for him to say that he knew Jesus in this hour when Jesus needed him. And but Peter doesn't go out and weep. We're not told that. We're just told that Peter denied him. Whereas in Mark's gospel, Peter goes through this terrible denial of Jesus, and then he realizes what he has done. Now, again, back to that trial of Jesus in Mark, Jesus, at the end of it, what are they doing? They're mocking Jesus. They're saying, prophesy, prophesy. What did Jesus do at the Last Supper? When Peter said that he would never abandon him, Jesus prophesies and says, Peter, before the cock crows twice, you will deny having known me 3 times. And what happens? Peter does it. So as they're upstairs telling Jesus, or belittling Jesus and mocking him and saying, prophesy, what does Mark show us? That Jesus' prophecy comes true. He did prophesy. And so in a sense, Mark is almost mocking those who mock Jesus by showing us this picture of Jesus right afterwards having his prophesy coming true. He's mocking the mockers through it. And then he's also showing this picture of Peter that is more sympathetic. That Peter would be so torn up by it that he'd have to go out and weep. That he saw his own guilt. He recognized his own guilt and he wept over it. He was ashamed of it. That he got to that point. So that there was, and again, for Mark's community, there are members of that community who are being asked, because of the Nero's persecution, to not deny Jesus and to say that Jesus is their Lord and their Savior and go all the way to their death. So they're being asked to be martyrs to the faith. But some of them were not able to do that. They were, they lost their strength of faith in the midst of that persecution. And so they denied knowing Jesus in a sense. And yet Mark is offering them an opportunity, a means of coming back into the community. He's saying, you can be forgiven too. Look what Peter did. You can be forgiven too. Hmm. So it's a pastoral message being presented there too, by Peter's weeping in that gospel. Whereas John doesn't need to do that, doesn't need to present that. So he doesn't. But what John is trying to do is saying, because this disciple whom Jesus loved obviously was a very important disciple, whether it was John or whoever this disciple was. It might not have even been one of the 12, but whoever this disciple was that Jesus loved was so important to that community, and that John put him or her in a very prominent place in these last hours of Jesus' life. As you see, this disciple whom Jesus loved gets Peter in here, is a witness to the actual event of Peter's denial. Later on, this disciple will be a witness to Peter's reconciliation with Jesus. This disciple is a witness to the resurrection. This disciple is the only of the disciples present at the death of Jesus, at the crucifixion. And so it's assumed that this disciple whom Jesus loved, much of was their eyewitness into that community was their witness to much of what went on with Jesus' life. So they held that person in very high esteem, as the rest of the Christian community at that time held Peter in very high esteem. And it's assumed that Peter's witness was what Mark and the other disciples, it was his original witness that they were writing from. So he's shown very prominently in the synoptics, whereas he's prominent in the Gospel of John, but this disciple whom Jesus loved becomes more important, you might say, because that person was the first to believe in the resurrection. That person was the one present at the death of Jesus. That person was the one who Jesus entrusted his mother to. So these were, whoever that person was a very important person in the community that John is writing for, or the Gospel of John is being written for, as a theological statement. So again, he doesn't necessarily, he tells the same story, but he tells it very differently than Mark did. So we're getting, so, we're going to start with I think I'll stop off here. Do you have any questions or comments? Because I think what I'll do is I'll go into the next week. We'll go into the arrest and the trial before Pilate, and then we'll go into the crucifixion and so forth starting next week. But because I think we only have about a few minutes left tonight, so if you don't have any other thoughts or questions or comments, then I want to close by, like I said, Mark's gospel. He's reflecting the image of the suffering servant of Isaiah. And I want to read to you one of these servant songs. Okay, a part of it. In the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Here's my servant whom I uphold, my chosen, in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations. He will not cry or lift up his voice, or make it heard in the street. A bruised reed he will not break, and a dimly burning wick he will not quench. He will faithfully bring forth justice. He will not grow faint or be crushed until he has established justice in the earth, and the coastlands wait for his teaching. The word of the Lord. So, thank you, everybody.
Father, can I just make one comment?
Yep.
So it seems like there's no insignificant details in these stories. Everything seems to matter. So I just have a question. Is there any significance about the charcoal fire? Only because it's mentioned in another time, a charcoal fire, when Jesus prepared the fire for the fish. I didn't know if that had any significance.
I don't know. I mean, I'm sure that somebody has made some connections that way. It could be, but I don't know, honestly.
Okay.
I mean, there's so many details to look at and to study that it's hard to get a handle on all of them. And I think that like, and the other thing is too that, like, I've told you some of these pictures and images that are there, right? But like, if you do some of your own reading on these things, you're going to find that, I mean, these are images the books I'm reading right now that are helping me to explain it a little bit. But there are other opinions on these things too. I'm expressing the opinions of one or two scholars, whereas there have been thousands and millions of scholars on these things over the course of the centuries, you know, and so to try to, you know, as I say these are some interpretations of these differences that I'm giving you, and I mean these are scholars that I'm talking about are well respected in their field these days, so that's why I'm using them as opposed to some of the others. But like I said, there's lots of different opinions and theories and points of view on this. So, you know, I'm sure you could find somebody that has found a reason for those details of the charcoal fire. And I mean, it really is fascinating to study scripture.
It is.
Yeah, it really is. It's just because it opens up so much, and it causes questions to faith too. But I think at the same time it offers paths into a deeper faith too.
Especially when you're comparing two readings like this.
Yeah. I mean, they weren't written that way to be compared, but they can be. I think it can be enriching too for our faith to look at them.
Mm-hmm.
I think, Linda, you probably rank with some of the scripture scholars simply because you've identified a common theme in the charcoal fire between Peter's denial and then Peter's agreeing that he loves Jesus three
Yeah.
times,
Yeah,
you know, on the shore. So the fact that the charcoal fire is a common denominator that you've discovered causes us to relate the two, you know, the denial and the acclamation of love in the same frame.
Yeah, it's to me, it just seems significant because they didn't just say there was a fire. They call it was a charcoal fire. And the
Yeah.
other reading that we hear, it's a charcoal fire. And that just kind of jumped out at me. I'm like, you know, the first time I can remember hearing it, it's like, oh, wonder where they got the charcoal, you know? that kind of silly thing.
they got it at the grocery store.
But yeah, you know how I think. So, but anyhow, it just seemed there has to be a significance in my mind. Otherwise, why would they refer to it that way? But thanks, Mike.
Yeah.
This is very interesting to pull things apart.
Yeah. I studied this, you know, 30 years ago, and it's eye-opening for me again to do it again, you know, because it is fascinating. Yeah.
Well, we thank you for doing this for us.
No, I'm very grateful to do it.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, everybody. See you next week.
You betcha. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.